So, back in January 2026, the US government dropped millions of pages of documents. You know the ones, the Epstein Files. Now, the whole idea was supposed to be about transparency, right? But what we got instead was a massive storm of controversy. So, over the next few minutes, we're going to cut through all that noise. We'll look at what was actually in those files, how a huge political fight forced them out into the open, and maybe most importantly, why the biggest questions are still just hanging there, unanswered.
All right, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll nail down what these files actually are. Then we'll dive into what's inside them, talk about the political battle to get them released, look at the pretty messy release process itself, and finally, the global fallout and all the questions that are still left.
Okay, let's get right to it. First things first. What are the Epstein Files?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much speculation, right? So many theories floating around. So let's cut to the chase. What are we actually talking about when we use that term, the Epstein Files?
Okay, so the first thing you got to understand is that this is not some simple client list. That's a huge misconception. What the Epstein Files really are is a massive, sprawling collection of evidence. We're talking about everything the FBI gathered in its criminal cases against Epstein and his whole network. So think contact books, flight logs, court documents, financial records. It's a gigantic trove of information.
And the scale of this thing? It's just staggering. I mean, the big document drop in January 2026 alone was over 3.5 million pages. To put that in perspective, that's more than 300 gigabytes of data. It's an almost unimaginable amount of information for any single person or even a team of people to really dig through.
All right, so we know it's huge, but what's actually in those millions of pages? Let's take a look.
Well, the contents are all over the map, really. You've got these draft indictments that prosecutors wrote up but never actually used. There are FBI notes on who they thought were potential co-conspirators. And of course, there are those infamous flight logs. But it goes way deeper than that. We're also talking about the financial records from his $600 million estate, private emails with all sorts of powerful academics and politicians, and even internal documents about the investigation into his death back in 2019.
And you know, one of the most shocking things in there is a draft indictment from way back in 2007. Think about that. It shows that federal prosecutors knew even then that Epstein was a, and I'm quoting here, continued danger to the community. But what happened? That whole case got shelved in favor of that infamous plea deal, the one that was criticized for being so incredibly lenient.
And all of this leads us right into the middle of a political firestorm. See, the question of whether to even release these files, that wasn't just some dry legal debate. Oh no, it turned into an all-out political battle right in the heart of Washington.
And right at the center of this fight was this just massive flip-flop. So during the 2024 campaign, Donald Trump promised he'd probably release the files. But then fast forward to July 2025, and the Department of Justice completely changes its tune. They put out this memo saying, nope, no client list exists, and we're not releasing any more documents. And that right there set the stage for a huge confrontation.
Well, as you can imagine, the DOJ's reversal just lit a fire in Congress. House Democrats started pushing hard for a vote, and then something really interesting happened. A bipartisan group launched what's called a discharge petition. Now, this is a pretty rare political tool. It's basically a way for rank-and-file members to go around leadership and force a vote on something they're trying to block. And guess what? It started gaining unstoppable momentum. The administration saw the writing on the wall and was forced to flip-flop again. Just a few days later, the Epstein Files Transparency Act was signed into law. It was a wild ride.
So, okay, the law passed. The files had to come out. Victory, right? Well, not so fast. The story is far from over at this point, because the way these files were released created an entirely new and, frankly, shocking controversy.
So the documents came out in two main batches. The first drop in December 2025 was pretty small, and it got hammered with criticism from literally everyone, both parties, because the redactions were so heavy-handed and just plain sloppy. But then came the main event in January 2026, over 3 million pages. And this one was an absolute mess, just plagued with catastrophic errors.
And when I say failures, I mean they were staggering. It really makes you wonder if it was just gross incompetence or maybe a super rush job to hit a deadline. So first, get this. The redactions, the black boxes over text, they were done so badly that literally anyone could just copy and paste the text into another document and poof, the hidden words would appear. It's unbelievable. Second, and this is just devastating, the full names of at least 43 victims were left totally exposed. And third, they actually published unredacted nude photos of young women,
some of them possibly teenagers, right there on a public government website.
And this quote from the lawyers for over 200 of the victims, it just says it all. They called the release, and I'm quoting directly, the single most egregious violation of victim privacy in one day in United States history. Just let that sink in. A process that was supposed to be about transparency ended up re-traumatizing the very people it was meant to help find justice.
And you have to understand, the impact of all this wasn't just contained within the US, not by a long shot. The revelations in these files sent absolute shockwaves all around the world.
So, once the files came out and citizens from several European countries were named, their governments started to take action. We saw Turkey, Lithuania, and Latvia all launch their own human trafficking investigations, basically trying to figure out if their own people had been caught up in Epstein's web.
And the fallout didn't stop with investigations. It also triggered a whole bunch of high-profile resignations. Over in the UK, Peter Mandelson, who's a huge political figure, he resigned from his party and the House of Lords. Then, in Slovakia, the Prime Minister's own national security advisor stepped down. And in Sweden, the head of the country's UNHCR partner resigned after it came out that she had visited Epstein's private island.
Meanwhile, back in the States, public opinion was, well, it was brutal. A CNN poll from that January found that almost half of Americans were dissatisfied with how the whole thing was handled. And get this, only 6% were satisfied. But what about that giant 45% chunk of people who said they were unsure? To me, that just screams widespread confusion and a deep distrust in the entire process.
And this, right here, gets to the absolute heart of why so many questions are still hanging in the air. The Department of Justice came out and said its January release fulfilled all its legal obligations. Case closed, right? But here's the thing. The DOJ had previously told lawmakers that it had identified around 6 million pages of potentially relevant material. So the big question is, why did only half of those pages ever see the light of day?
And it's that huge discrepancy that leaves us with the one single massive question that hangs over this entire saga. Because even after everything that's come out, after all the investigations, the resignations, the messy political fights, we know that millions of pages are still being kept from the public. So you have to wonder, what else is still hidden in the Epstein files?